the APT and Cybersecurity LinkedIn Live event. My name is Aaron Stillwell, and I'm joined by a special co-host, Maren Vizik, founder and CEO of Applied Quantum and SANS instructor focused on cybersecurity, resilience, and emerging technology risk. Today, we're talking about one of the biggest long-term challenges facing cybersecurity leaders: how to prepare for the rise of quantum computing and what it can mean for today's cryptographic foundations. As quantum capabilities continue to evolve, organizations are being pushed to think seriously about post-quantum cryptography, or what they call PQC. Google said it is setting a timeline to migrate PQC by 2029, urging companies to follow suit. Google warns that action is needed before a future of quantum computing can break current encryption. To help us unpack this, we're joined by Raj Badwar, Chief Information Officer at Systems Planning and Analysis, and author of several books including The CISO's Next Frontier, AI, Post-Quantum Cryptography, and Advanced Security Paradigms. Today, we'll explore what leaders need to understand about standards, migration, prioritization, crypto agility, governance, and the practical path from theory to execution. Raj and Maren, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely, Aaron. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Raj, thank you so much.
Thank you, Aaron. Happy to be here, and apologize for not being on video, but look forward to an exciting conversation here.
No, thank you. So let's start off with the first question, Raj. How do you describe the current state of post-quantum cryptography for leaders who know change is coming, but are still trying to separate standards, algorithms, and real urgency?
Yeah, I think that is a fundamental question that many people are asking or pondering about in the industry, right? Both the practitioners and the folks that are, looking at it from an outside perspective. And I believe that, and I think I can also say, with Maren, and maybe we'll hear his feedback on this as well, is that, we have officially moved on from the so-called science fiction phase into an infrastructure upgrade phase, right? In 2026, for example, we are firmly in what we call as the noisy intermediate scale quantum era, where we really don't at the moment have a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, which we call CRQC, capable of breaking like RSA, for example. But the timeline, in my humble opinion, has compressed. And Maren can, correct me or give some additional feedback there. So what we feel, talking to industry experts and major, tech players, is that we think that, a window of something like 2029 to maybe 2030 is the window where quantum utility may become a serious risk to classical encryption techniques or algorithms like, SHA or AES and otherwise, right? So we feel that the reality check is this, right? That the hardware is still noisy, but we feel that the software and algorithms for PQC have been finalized, as you obviously know, with NIST, right? With crystals, and Sphinx and Falcon, right? So we feel that the software and algorithms for PQC have been finalized, are shipping in production, and even in operating systems like Android, right? Android 17, for example. So I feel that that's where we stand at the moment. Again, we will see how this ecosystem matures, but that's at least how I would summarize this to your question. And I'm sure that Maren probably has some interesting details or additional highlight he can share.
Yeah, Maren, would you like to offer that?
Raj, you summarized it much better than I could have. But yeah, look, engineering is still a huge challenge. But I'd like to add a little bit more of a reality check. The whole conversation around when exactly quantum computer will arrive and whether it's going to break RSA in 29 or in 39, I would argue that by now it's almost irrelevant. It's a conversation that takes too much time and effort and takes the attention away from the reality that we have to start migrating to the post-quantum cryptography because the ecosystem has moved. So the regulators have put the deadlines in almost every jurisdiction. The national cyber or security agencies, the sectoral regulators have issued their expectations, and they kind of converge 2028 to 2031 for the critical systems, 2035, the long tail, all of the systems should be upgraded to PQC. With the regulations, the insurers are changing. The insurers first carved out the quantum threat or the quantum impact, but now this year, big insurers are preparing quantum readiness assessments, and your premiums will be dependent on whether you have quantum plan and you've done discovery and the first steps. The clients, large buyers, and we work with some of them, are putting that into their RFPs and into their vendor management. Last year, we saw first few instances of earning calls and AGMs where the financial analysts and shareholders asked from the CEO, what are you doing about the quantum preparation? So right now, the discussion about when exactly the Q day is coming is almost irrelevant. You have to move because the ecosystem has moved. And that's the reality check.
Yeah, Marin, one comment I would make is, like you said, even the cyber insurers or have been asking that question, and it's a relevant thing for companies to consider, right? And their premiums may depend upon it. It is especially relevant for firms, like that deal, for example, financial services, right?
Yep.
Or if you are in somehow related to the defense ecosystem, the defense industrial base, as I call it, that's where the risk is, in my opinion, higher than maybe other areas like maybe retail, right? So I think that is something, again, that has a bearing on, like, when people are listening to this and they're thinking, okay, is it relevant for me because I am in this industry? The relevancy is there across the board, but it may be higher risk for some industries than the others.
Absolutely, because your quantum readiness, and for the first few years, it doesn't mean you have to be quantum ready. It means you have to have started your quantum readiness program and have a plan and have a discovery. But that is going to become your permission to play in your industries. And you're absolutely right, Raj. It's going to be defense and FS. Later, all of the critical national infrastructure industries. But if you have not started it on time, you won't be able to, either get regulatory permits or bid on the projects that you would normally bid and so on. So, that's the reality check, is that you don't have a choice. If you are responsible for cybersecurity in your organization, doesn't matter when the quantum computing comes, you have to start.
Right. One final comment I'll make on this is, the question that was asked of me as a CISO at one of financial services organizations, working on the street, was that, and this was a little bit like a couple of years ago, like 4 years ago, was that, okay, well, at that point of time, PQC was not finalized, right? We were working on like NTRU encrypt, right, or multivariate or hash-based cryptography or whatever else. So those theoretical constructs were being discussed, right? But we didn't have, like, for example, what NIST did, like, with crystals, dilithium, kyber, or whatever, right? So the question was asked was, what are you doing today? How are you going to, if there is any risk today, like, have you made any preparations for hardening existing cryptography, right? And, we could have given a theoretical answer. We could have said no. But I think that it made us in the industry think about, okay, are there any things that we could do to harden existing, algorithms while we think about a PQC ecosystem, which is now obviously very well defined. It wasn't back then. But I think the question is still relevant, that not everybody can adopt, right, or is ready to adopt PQC. So, like, some basic things I thought maybe I shared, at least that I was privy to and took part in, is like enhancing existing cryptographic schemes, like, for example, improving something as basic as Diffie-Hellman, right? So, like, thinking about elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, the ECDH, or like super singular isogeny Diffie-Hellman, which is what we call as SIDH, right? Or even some techniques that we have known as cryptographers for a very long time, like cascade ciphering. That's something becomes important, right? Or potentially talking about increasing the key size for existing algorithms. Like, for example, like, maybe consider increasing the data block from, to 256 bits, right? Or increasing the key size from 376 to, like, for example, 512, right? So on increasing the number of rounds that you run for existing algorithms, right? Like for AES 256, from 14 rounds, you can maybe go to 28 rounds. So I think those are some of the interesting things that at least we experimented with in the industry, and also provided that as a response to auditors or risk analysts as they were thinking about this, especially in the financial services world where they were very paranoid, right? And I'm sure that some of those conversations occurred in the defense sector with NSA and otherwise. So something that I thought like that we have been, as thinkers, have been thinking about this problem. What can we do today while we think about a good future state of PQC tomorrow? And this was a conversation in the past, but now obviously PQC is very well defined. But I thought of at least sharing that, is that we have been thinking about this problem.
Raj, that's a really good point. And I mean, we kind of went a little bit off the initial question, Aaron, but I hope you don't mind, because this is a fascinating and important discussion.
No, please go ahead.
So the PQC is standardized, but the PQC is not going to be a solution for every instance of quantum vulnerable cryptography. So all of these compensatory controls, alternatives that Raj was talking about are still valid, even though we have PQC. The PQC might, sometimes, or not sometimes, in 60 to 80% of the cases, you will be dependent on the others, which might not have the same upgrade path or the upgrade timelines as you. PQC have a different resource requirement and key sizes and so on. So certain systems might not be able to handle it initially. If you are communicating with somebody who is not PQC ready yet, you will have to do both the PQC and the classical cryptography. So there is lots of reasons why the straightforward upgrade to PQC is not going to work for a large number of use cases, which means you will have to do hybrid approaches, some kind of very smart alternative approaches. Tokenizing sensitive data, isolating or segmenting, the small parts of network that you can't upgrade, and then build some kind of a quantum safe proxies or cryptographic gateways that will, create a quantum safe tunnel for the communication, and so on and on. So, all of these approaches that Raj was mentioning are still valid, even though we have PQC standardized now.
Raj, I do have a question, kind of move forward a little bit. What do organizations most need to understand about the NIST selected algorithms?
Yeah, no, I think that a good question there, right? So like with NIST, especially with the finalization of like FIPS 203, which is the ML-Chem, or 204, which is DSA, or 205, which is again SLH DSA. It means that, like what we were doing back then was like the wait and see or wait and watch period, which is over, right? So now the conversation has really changed for us, is like, okay, from if what we were talking a couple of years ago to how, right? So like, for example, the critical takeaway, in my opinion, is that these algorithms are not the drop-in replacements, right? So it's just like what Maren was saying, right? Like they have larger key sizes, have different performance profiles, right? And so like us as security leaders and IT leaders have to understand that implementing these standards is very much about network performance and hardware compatibility, right? As it is about the mathematics. And like, for example, like some of the NIST approved algorithms that I mentioned even earlier, right? I mean, they're already out there, like Crystal, Kyber, Crystal, the Lithium, or Sphinx, and Falcon. So I feel that NIST has done their job, right? They have provided the path to us. And now it is for us to work with the implementers. Like, for example, how do you implement that in TLS? How do you actually, like, working with the creators, like with Microsoft of the world, or the Googles of the world, or Oracles of the world, right? How do we actually get them implemented in mainstream applications? Something as basic as TLS, right? So I think that's where we stand. But again, FIPS has done its job. NIST, FIPS guidance is out. NIST has done its job. And now it's going to be on us as industry implementers and adopters of technology to take the mantle forward, in my humble opinion.
Raj, again, that's such a great answer. And Aaron, I do have two things to add. The first one is I'd like to take it a little bit, to the basics, because we are, and I think most of the audience are in cybersecurity, talking about this daily, so they kind of understand it. But I'm in this position that I do get to talk to lots of CISOs, daily, and I do have to explain or make this very clear because it's a question I get very often. PQC, post-quantum cryptography, is a classical software running on classical machines. It's just a different algorithm, but everything else around the deployment is classical. And I have to stress that because I do hear it quite often from CISOs who are first time, faced with this question. They tell me, "Oh, well, we can't start the PQC upgrade. We haven't hired a quantum physicist yet." You don't need quantum physicists. You don't need quantum knowledge. You have all the capabilities most likely already in your team. And it is a classical algorithm, just one that is resistant to the type of attacks that quantum computers can mount. And then there is another comment related to this. I'm not sure if we were planning to tackle it, so I'll just jump in here. NIST did an absolutely amazing job. They were the first one to start this standardization and testing over the 8 years, first one to issue the standard. However, if you are a global company or international company or your estate is international, I think you need to be aware that the rest of the world is a little bit diverging from NIST standard alone. In the past, NIST only would have been the only solution needed that you need to know, except maybe Russia always had their own cryptographic standards. But now there is a more fragmentation around the world. China is developing their own standards. South Korea did something. India, Netherlands, and others are maybe using NIST, but adding some additional algorithms that are not NIST approved. So there is a huge level of complexity in managing a global or international estate and having to upgrade now to the quantum safe standards and making sure that they all talk to each other and they all adhere to the local standards.
Raj,
I
what do
agree,
you?
Marin. One
Oh,
comment.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
I was just going to make a comment, but I think you have it right. You hit the nail on the head that the math on these PQC algorithms, as we call them, was done actually many years ago, right? People were doing their PhD theses in the 80s and 70s and 90s, and actually, like, for all the work with lattice-based encryption, right, or like multivariate or hash-based or code-based cryptography, right? I mean, this stuff was being discussed 30 years ago. The math was already figured out. At that point of time, the industry thought that the implementation would be obviously difficult and expensive from a compute perspective. That's how it was taught back then. And so we obviously gravitated towards like something as basic as the common algorithms that we use today, like RSA, for example, right? And obviously RSA is awesome, but this is not rocket science. This math was done before actually even RSA proof was done, right? So and now we are realizing obviously the potential of these things, right? The better compute capability. So I think that people shouldn't be scared of this. I think they get all carried away with this quantum, the qubits and how they differ from the regular bits, and I think they get worried about the whole the quantum mechanics angle. But the reality of the algorithms is that this is established science.
Yeah, excellent.
So I do see a question right here, and actually I was kind of going to that about this. I guess this harvest now, decrypt later, risk today. Can you guys each one kind of talk about the risks of those and where you see that moving?
Yeah, I see there are some really good comments and questions in the audience. Great. So yeah, we have a question from Mustafa about harvest now, decrypt later. So yes, in short, you should be already doing your quantum readiness program, which means some of the first phases, such as doing some discovery, having a strategy, engage vendors. These are now even explicitly expected by many regulators as your first phases. In this year or in the previous year, you should have done that. The harvest now, decrypt later is a special, interesting case where, just for the benefit of the rest of the audience, where the idea is that the adversaries are sucking in data already today from various ways, from the air, from the backbone connectivity, from various ways. They are taking all of these encrypted data and they are storing it for the next 5 or 10 or 15 years with the idea that they would decrypt it once they have quantum computers, and then obviously benefit from access to any data that still has value 10 years from now. And there's quite a lot of that, from military secrets, government communications, company strategies, and so on and on. So the idea is that lots of data is being sucked today, and it will be breached once they have quantum computers. It's an interesting one because anything that is harvested today, we can't do anything about that anymore. Once it's harvested, we cannot unharvest it. Because of that, lots of national security agencies, intelligence agencies have issued guidances and notices and so on, stating that harvest now, decrypt later is happening, and that the companies should start preparing. Because it is such a type of risk that every day of a delay basically creates more data that is harvested and potentially breached in the future, you should consider doing harvest now or addressing the harvest now, decrypt later risk quickly amongst the first steps that you do, while in parallel you are doing your big program strategy and so on. You should try to tackle the harvest now, decrypt later, at least for your crown jewels, for your most sensitive data. And what does it mean, tackle? Well, re-encrypt it with the quantum safe algorithms. So in storage, in transfer, wherever you have an opportunity, you should start encrypting with PQC today. There is another term that you guys should be aware of, which is the trust now, forge later. While harvest now, decrypt later focuses on the confidentiality, long-lived confidentiality of the data. The other side of the coin is trust now, forge later, where the digital signatures, certificates could be forged in the future. That's a similar kind of category of a threat where something that is that we use today could be forged in the future. And again, we have to start reducing the lifetimes of the certificates. If we have some contracts that are digitally signed, we should re-sign it using PQC algorithms, and so on and on. And I try to speed up a little bit, not to take too much time, because I'd really like to hear from Raj as well.
Yeah, no, I think this is definitely something that's on our radar, right, in the industry. So like what we call this as HNDL, which is, again, like you said, harvest now, decrypt later. And we in the industry, we call it, in the defense sector especially, we call it a tier 1 risk, right, that we have to be worried about, right? So, and again, I don't know when CRQC is going to happen, just like Marin said, right? It could be 2030, it could be 35, 39, I don't know. We can't predict that at the moment, right? But the reality is that this is obviously for high consequence environments. Like what we have to treat this like is the data is gone, right? And now a simple, like way of putting this is, like plain old English, is that, oh, now that the threat actors or the adversaries are waiting for the key to read it. They have it, and they may eventually read it, right? But I think what we should also focus on today is then, okay, well, okay, good. We've talked about the risk. What are you going to do about it? What can we do today? Right? So I think what and this may be a little technical, but I was actually working on a white paper on this. So like some of the steps that we could probably do is like, for example, something that I mentioned earlier is like, okay, well, we should adopt something what we call as MLDSA 65 as the target standard, which is again, NIST has finalized MLDSA, which is FIPS 204. So that could be the primary replacement for something like a ECDSA or RSA. So like, like we should think about adopting it, because even if JWT or JOT tokens, as you were talking about, are short-lived, right? The signing keys could be long-lived, right? So even if you
Yep.
capture a public key today towards a future quantum threat actor to forge your identity parameter, the signing keys, if they are long-lived, right, are riskier, right? So what we could also do is, at least in my opinion, is that like we could implement like hybrid signatures or capabilities. So like if you are unable to jump into PQC, depending on what your journey is, where you stand in your maturity index, right? One approach could be that a best practice could be figure hybrid. Right? So for example, sign the JOT tokens with traditional algorithm and with MLDSA, right? So like obviously you can maintain compatibility with legacy clients. Uh, you know, even if you can ensure that if a flaw is found, like an early MLDSA implementation, your security will still default back to a proven classical math. So I think that could be one thing. Also, like for example, inventorize and reconfigure your infrastructure, right? So like for example, the shift to MLDSA isn't just a code change, by the way. Keep that in mind, right? It's also a signature size change, right? So like the header limits, for MLDSA are significantly larger, like for example, than ECDSA, right? So, currently we have problems like many of our web servers like Nginx or Apache or others, right? Or load balancer that we use like F5, they default to like a 4 KB or a 8 KB limit of HTTP headers, right? Which is also a problem. So again, like we should audit our ingress controllers or API gateways that we use, like Apogee or otherwise, right? To ensure that they can handle the bloated headers that is going to happen if you were to use PQC signed JOT tokens, right? And I think the last thing I'll say on this is that, IAM vendors, we got to pressure them, right? So like the Oktas of the world, the Pink Federates of the world, and ask for their PQC roadmaps, right? Where is the JWK support? Where is the algorithm negotiation capabilities, right? So again, there's a lot more I can say on this, but again, I think that some of us are at least trying to think about these problems.
Raj, great, and this is such a good answer, and just I'll add a few more practical things for the audience to be aware. So yes, as both Raj and I mentioned, your most likely path is going to be through hybrid implementations, and there is various flavors of hybrids before you go full PQC. And then a couple of things you should be aware. The first one is there's multiple flavors of hybrid PQC implementations, and there's lots of guidances coming out. The IETF has draft standards for various, so you can look at that one. The other thing is regulators not only accept it, but they even expect it to be hybrid. So, if you are in a regulated industry, it is acceptable. Your auditors or examiners will take into account hybrid implementation as a valid one, because it's a reality in the industry that will have to go through hybrid. Unfortunately, one thing that you should also be aware is hybrid creates additional management and maintenance challenges. Now you have basically two cryptographic primitives to manage for every instance where you previously had one. So you'll have to do double the maintenance. You'll have to make sure that it all works well together. If you are using a hybrid solution that can automatically downgrade to a classical one, now you need to start monitoring for that downgrade. At what instances does it happen? Is it maybe something that adversaries have forced in order to hack, or is it something that is managed and with a valid reason? So maybe implementing that into your security operations. And then you still have to plan with moving from hybrid to PQC in a couple of years when it becomes feasible. So most likely path is through hybrid, but hybrid makes your work more complex. So you should be aware of that.
Yeah, no, I agree. One final comment I'll make on that also is, like practical challenges, right? So we can say hybrid, and if you look at the IETF draft, they emphasize that the MLDSA keys should be generated and then stored in hardware security modules, which we use it for traditional cryptography, right? Or any other secure enclaves that may have, that support AES 256 wrapping. But the reality is that even like the native MLDSA supporting HSMs is still not there. From what I know, right? So I think that we have to make sure that as we should ensure that our transition plans, if we have any, if you're thinking about it, include hardware refreshes, right, for your root of trust, because that may or may not be there today, right? But again, if we implement MLDSA 65, something like that in a hybrid configuration today, then we can basically, like improve our quantum resistance, rendering today's, harvested, whatever traffic that may have been harvested useless for future forgery, right? So something for us to keep in mind. But again, the reality is that's why we need the industry support. Is like we can come up with solutions and ideas, but then the practical implementation has to be there to support them.
Raj, if you don't mind me ask, what is the difference between quantum resistance versus quantum safe paradigms?
I think I tried addressing that earlier as well, right? So quantum safe is, all the PQC algorithms are quantum safe, right? They're theoretically resistant or safe from quantum computing attacks, like for example, a breach, right, of algorithms. So like a quantum computer it can breach, for example, RSA, but it would not be able to breach something like lattice-based cryptography or crypto algorithm, right? So that's quantum safe. But quantum resistant is an algorithm that is resistant to it. It may eventually be brute forced, but it's going to fight back. It can resist an attack. So some of the schemes I was talking about earlier, like, for example, improving Diffie-Hellman or increasing the key size or increasing the number of rounds for existing algorithms or EAS or whatever, right, are techniques that we could use. Or even like, for example, one thing I found good, I did some writing on this using something called sponge functions, right? So like, for example, SHA-3, which is based on something called Kachek. So these things are resistant by the nature of the algorithm, and they can resist an attack. Obviously, they are not completely bulletproof. So that's what I mean by resistant versus quantum safe.
Maren, did you want to add anything on that?
And I could not possibly add anything. Such a great answer.
That's perfect. So next question, Raj, for leaders trying to avoid both complacency and the hype, how do you decide what needs attention now versus what can be phased in over time?
I think, again, maybe Maren, you take a shot at this first. I want to see what you have to say about this, and then I'll chime in.
Oh my God, Aaron, how much time do we have?
We have 28 minutes. Go ahead.
Well, this is, and actually I saw some good questions amongst the audience that are around this as well. So I think you are asking about how do leaders pick between between a hype and well, basically ignoring it. And the problem is that right now there is a lots of misinformation, lots of hype in this whole world, and thank you, Aaron, for organizing this, because exactly through these kind of events we can educate and raise awareness. But right now we have two extremes. We have a huge number of CISOs and cyber owners who are just not paying sufficient attention to it. It's not yet on their radar, or They they believe that it's, since the quantum computer is not arriving for another 10 years, we don't have to worry yet about it. And that's a problem. And we explained a little bit earlier that, the ecosystem is moving, so they have to move with it. Um, there is an interesting survey from IBM from September last year. They've interviewed 750, cyber professionals across the world, and 63% of them stated that it is a vendor problem. So vendor is going to solve a PQC, right? The assumption is that they can just press on a Tuesday patch and upgrade to PQC at one point in time. That's another awareness, another challenge that we have to explain, or we have to raise awareness. It's not a vendor-only problem. You, as a cybersecurity owner, you are accountable. You still own the outcomes in your organization, and there's many other technical reasons why that's not really a good idea. So one problem is we need to create that sufficient pressure and make sure that people understand that you need to move now. There is one more reason why we need to move now, because migrating to PQC is a huge, massive enterprise transformation program. Mustafa, that's to your question. It's not a technical upgrade program. It is an enterprise transformation. For many organizations, it is going to be the largest IT, OT, cyber transformation they have ever attempted. And we now have some anecdotal evidence, and we have peer-reviewed papers that says that for larger organizations, PQC upgrade is a 5 to 15 years duration program. So if you think that it's 5 to 15 years for a large enterprise, but all of the regulations are converging to 5 years from now, there's another reason you need to start now, because most of the organizations are already late with starting. That's why I asked you, Aaron, how much time we have, because I could talk about this for hours. But that's one side. That's the kind of the quantum procrastination. That's postponing the action because of lack of clarity or lack of awareness. There is another one that actually is my pet peeve that drives me crazy, is all the hype and the alternative, where right now we have lots of noise about the quantum computers coming tomorrow. We actually do have, and I know because people call me in the middle of the night when they hear the statements from some vendors saying that they have a special algorithm that can crack RSA 2048, or they have insider information from NSA that Chinese already have a quantum computer and they are cracking RSA 2048, and so on and on. There are some papers that came out over the last few years that media picked up on and just started claiming that RSA is broken. So there's also lots of hype in the other direction. And I want to make it very clear for the participants, and there was a question earlier by the audience, there is no quantum computer capable of cracking RSA 2048 or related security level cryptography, and that's guaranteed. It's not in the secret national labs. The science doesn't work that way. The supply chain doesn't work that way. There is a whole host of reasons why we know that nobody has cracked RSA 2048 yet. And if any vendor tells you that, just walk them out, because that's bullshit. Pardon my language, Aaron. So I think between both of those two extremes, the only thing we can do to motivate and to drive the action in the right way is through education and awareness. And I hope, regulators and national agencies will put even more effort into that.
Yeah,
Now I got all of this. I don't even know whether I fully answered your question, Aaron.
Yes, you did.
Yeah, no, I was gonna add, and that's why I wanted to hear from you because see, from the seat that I have, right, as a CISO and a CIO and a CTO before, right, the reality is that getting these things funded is not easy. We barely get the funding for our regular operations that we have, right? I'm talking in the industry, right? So like making the case, a case that can be sold to leadership, right? Because eventually, like we live in a world where it is all about today. What is our earnings per share? What is our profit margin? Right? How much EBITDA are we delivering? Right? So in that world, when you ask for investments, then okay, hey, this is a risk that is on the horizon, right? It was rising and now it's risen even more, and we have to take steps now proactively to really fix this risk, right? So getting that investment is not easy. I'm just telling you, from a practical industry practitioner perspective. So that's where we have to get creative about it. First of all, we have to have industry leaders like Marin, yourself, and others, right? Talk about what is a real risk and separate the hype from it so that it can be trusted. Because if we can't establish that trust, and if we say, well, it's going to be, RSA is going to break in 2 years, so we only have 2 years left, right? Well, and if that doesn't happen, well, then we lose credibility, right? So that's where I think we have to pose the risk in such a manner that this is risk avoidance. This is how we practically improve. This is not a big bang approach that tomorrow we're going to migrate over to PQC, right? Everything. And so I think that is something that we have to be able to stand behind as industry leaders and technologists. So that's why, like, how can we bake in investments for research and slow implementations and migrations while we are obviously doing the current engineering and operations of our stack, right? As security professionals and otherwise. So I think that is the challenge that we face. For example, when I tried to talk to this about my leadership in one of my former organizations, even to the board, they looked at me as if I was crazy because either they hadn't heard about it or they had heard the other paradigm that this is all bloated and made up, right? This is not gonna, it's not possible, right? So for example, like, so but what that the other advice I can give to the technologists is that, like, ignore the record qubit counts without error correction data kind of a conversation. Focus on the logical qubit breakthroughs or error correction milestones. Like even from, like, if you see the announcements that are coming from firms like Quantium or Google regarding their lower gate error rates, are the real signals that the useful quantum era is approaching, right? So I think that's how we have to think about it. But again, there's a lot of hype, and then there's also scare tactics. When we talk about this, we should not be seen as scaremongers, right? We are talking about technology. We understand the technology, and we're talking about a risk that is over the horizon and how to manage that risk better. I think that is our mission.
Absolutely. Raj, that's great. And since you mentioned the getting the investment, I'll add few ideas. Not that I have a single answer that would work for everyone, but luckily I'm in this position that we are helping CISOs prepare for these business cases and presenting to their boards at least once a week. So we have few different things that we try to demonstrate in these business cases, investment presentations. So let me give you a couple more ideas. Yes, it is a risk exposure reduction exercise. And if the question is when the Q day comes, we don't know, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now, that's not going to motivate any executive or board to give us money. There's, however, a couple of other things. The first one is what I mentioned at the beginning. The ecosystem has moved. Your premiums will be dependent on that. Your regulators will ask. If you are in regulated industry, your permission to operate, or maybe earlier than that, your permission to innovate might be impacted or made easier if you are quantum ready. There is more than that, however. Right now, with all of this hype and all the media attention and so on, you can claim PR benefits, marketing benefits, competitive advantage benefits if you are amongst the first in your industry who can validly claim that you are quantum safe. So that's taking the money not just as a pure risk exposure reduction cost, but as an investment into competitive positioning. So you turn it around a little bit. Lots of organizations are looking at quantum technologies from the benefit side, not from just, as a threat to the cybersecurity, but for example, about 80% of the top 50 global banks are doing quantum algorithm development, so quantum finance experimentation, using quantum algorithms for portfolio optimization, derivatives pricing, and so on. You could try to find some synergies. You could argue that investment in the quantum readiness is also investment in the upskilling and positioning in the market, and so on. So Raj is absolutely right. If you say we need lots of money to prevent some undefined risk at the undefined future, you will not get it. If you turn it around, you can start getting it. And finally, for cyber people here, whenever we started doing inventory or discovery of the quantum vulnerable algorithms, without single exception, we always found currently classically vulnerable cryptography as well. We still have, old obsolete cryptographic algorithms all over the estate. And basically it means that by doing the quantum readiness, we have also started reducing our risk exposure today, not just for the future threat. So, you can combine all of these angles in the right approach for your executive team and for your board, but you need to give them more meat than just undefined threat in undefined future.
Raj, I was going to ask you that question too. With now with the talk of AI, how do you prioritize AI versus the quantum?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. AI has taken over the conversation, right? And a lot of investments are going into that ecosystem for the time being.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I'm thinking how to answer this question in a futuristic way, right? And maybe I don't want this to be like a science fiction kind of a thing, right? So but I think that AI could be seen as like the maintenance capability for quantum, right? So for example, while the quantum hardware, quote unquote, is still in its noisy intermediate scale kind of a phase, right? While we don't have the meaningful qubits, as they're fragile and otherwise, I think AI could really help with purely quantum kind of sort of a definition, or quantum area is like error mitigation, right? So as you know, the machine learning algorithms, which is basically the basis for a lot of AI, so they identify and kind of filter out noise. They can actually filter out the noise in quantum calculations, because again, error correction is very important in quantum, right?
Yes.
So I feel that AI could help with error mitigation in a quantum world, quote unquote. AI could also help with calibration, right? So the AI agents, quote unquote, can handle the so-called constant second by second tuning required to keep superconducting qubits stable. Again, if you start getting into the qubit world, which we haven't talked much about, right? Or even AI assisted so-called compilers can take a complex problem and rewrite it into a most efficient quantum instructions to save processing time. So these are, again, AI could probably aid the quantum conversation, right? It could be, again, without getting into science fiction world, is like quantum, it could be the so-called the turbocharger for AI, feature mapping or optimizations or synthetic data creation, right? So I feel that could be somewhere where AI may have its role to play in the quantum computing world, right? And I'm sure Maren would probably come with another angle, but that's at least how I'm thinking about it, is like, how can we marry these two together and use some of our AI investments to further the quantum journey?
I love the answer, but yes, of course, I have different angles always. I want to also add that quantum actually has a massive promise for the AI as well. So once quantum computers, useful quantum computers appear, they actually have use for specific AI use cases, quantum machine learning. They can make some inference and training much more performant. So there is a convergence of the benefits of the quantum and AI. But I think, Aaron, your question was more about how do we carve out the budget for quantum now when all the budget goes to AI.
No, but
And
I like both discussions. So
good.
yeah,
But yes, so it's kind of, AI supporting quantum. Quantum, when it arrives, is going to make a step change in the AI capabilities as well. So it's kind of joined. But from the cyber budget perspective, I think you have to figure out the way to cover both. I don't know, this is not going to be a very useful answer, but our whole career in cybersecurity, we always had to balance all these kind of different priorities and different threats and different controls. It's the same thing now. We have to find a way to, budget for all of these emerging tech risks. That was a really disappointing answer. I don't have anything smarter than that.
no, that's fantastic. We only have 9 minutes left, and I think a good way to kind of finish this off is to ask kind of both of you if you wanted leaders to lead this conversation with one clear priority, what would you tell them to do first?
Well, I mean, that's a tough question. First is awareness and education. And I don't think that you should. Can I say two first things? So the first thing is awareness and education. And it doesn't mean that anybody has to become a quantum physicist or anything like that. But understanding the reality of the threat, of what the regulators expect, and so on. I think that's the first thing you should be doing. If you're not doing it yet, start doing some education, join the groups, I don't know, like QSecDef or similar that are kind of a membership based. But the first real thing on the journey to quantum readiness is cryptographic discovery or inventory. Not just because I say so, but because regulators and standards are positioning it as the first thing. The idea is you have to uncover all the instances of your quantum vulnerable cryptography in order to be able to mitigate it. We can talk a lot about what is the practical way of doing it, but yes, you should start with awareness education, and you should be on your way to doing the cryptographic inventory in some practical and pragmatic way. Not to complicate it further than that.
I totally agree. I think you start, first of all, understand what your crypto story is, right? Forget the quantum for a minute. You start off with where is your weak cryptography, because we all know that we are still running algorithms that have been breached, right? I know people are still using SHA-1, right? But breached
Yep.
many years ago. Obviously, they claim that, oh well, we use SHA-1 with salting, so it's actually secure. So I don't have to worry about it. But the reality is, so from there, just like what Marin said, is that you got to do your, what I call it, the cryptographic bill of materials, create your shadow crypto problem, identify that, figure out which of your algorithms are where and which of them are susceptible to a breach or a break, right? So that you know what the problem is. Define and identify the problem. And also, like you can't just do it randomly, right? You can't just be the poor CISO being held accountable for that. You identify somebody that is your crypto leader, that is going to be responsible for looking across your infrastructure, your applications, right? To make sure that you identify and quantify that problem, right? The other thing I would do is identify your high risk data. Not all your data is at high risk, but you're going to have your crown jewels. So identify what is your high risk data, right? And then again, high risk from a break-rich perspective, breach perspective, high risk from a compliance perspective, so that again, for that you may focus more on this. What the threat actors are doing is harvest now, decrypt later, right? So that is where they're going to be going after, is what is your crown jewels, right? So, and then prioritize your mitigation of risk for that crown jewel or that high risk data. And I think last thing I would suggest is, like, let's not forget procurement, right? We all buy software and systems and firmware from other people, right? So I think we should figure out, like, in our contract languages or requirements for crypto agility, right? So, like, if Microsoft and Amazon and Google can't do it, well, then how will the small ones do it, right? So I think that we should start making sure that we don't create a legal liability for us later by procuring software that's not agile from a cryptography perspective. So it's high time that our big vendors start at least leading the mantle in this migration journey, because we can't do it all by ourselves, right? So again, we are reliant on our key providers, our key CSPs, and they have to do that. And so therefore, we should put that language in our contracts, in our procurement contracts.
Absolutely.
And I was going to follow up with that because I did read the article today that Google put out migrate to PQC by 2029. How much of an impact do you think that's going to be with organizations?
I mean, it's a huge signal from Google. I wrote about that as well because it's kind of big news. Google is building quantum computers. They have one of the best or the most promising kind of quantum computing development. So when the same organization that is doing, in our case, the offensive side is also putting the deadlines on the defensive side, that is an important signal. However, on the other hand, keep in mind that most of the regulations are already somewhere around that timeline. There was a question from Corey about which regulations. Well, pretty much all of the national regulations. Australia expects critical infrastructure to be quantum upgraded to quantum safe by 28. They are the most ambitious. EU 2030, Canada for federal government 2031, US 2030 with 2035 for the long tail, for the non-critical systems. But basically, all of the national regulations are already in that period, 28 to 2031, and then Google matches it.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a signal. They didn't really say quantum computers are arriving by 2029, but they
No.
made
Yeah.
that decision based on some knowledge that they have, and they are the ones building quantum computers. So I hope it will drive some more awareness, interest, and action in the industry, if especially if you are not in a regulated industry.
Right. No, I agree. And I think I'll double down on that, is that look at what NIST is doing, right? So NIST is moving away from RSA and Diffie-Hellman and ECC, elliptic curve cryptography, right? So they've defined their deprecation dates. So, like, all these three are actually, per NIST, deprecating in 2030, right? So they are no longer considered best practice. So Google is obviously aligning with that. But like, at least what NIST has written is that they are disallowed by 2035. So if you live in a regulated world, especially in the defense industrial base, 2035 is not that far, guys, right? It's going to come very, very soon. And deprecation is you're going to start getting all these alerts and warnings after 2030. So it is high time, obviously, that the regulators are obviously signaling that. And with deprecation guidelines, that like just Marin said, the governments are talking about it, and now players like Google are talking about it. So I think, again, we all have to, and maybe this is something that we can take to our boards and to our leadership and say, look, this is what the regulators are saying. You might want to start investing in this ecosystem, because otherwise, again, it'll be 2029 and we still wouldn't have done anything.
And just to add, Aaron, just for the awareness of you and everyone else, Google started actually migrating in 2016. That's the first time that they were actually publishing the results of their experiments and migrations and so on. So that means that they are on this already for 10 years now. So if you haven't started yet, that could be another important signal for you that it's not a simple transition.
Well, gentlemen, we only have 1 minute left. First off, I want to thank both of you so much for joining us. And then I always like to leave time. Raj, if you'd like to talk about any promotion you're looking to do, any new books, we would love to hear it.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, I have written about PQC in the past, right? But at the moment, a lot of my recent work has been in the AI ecosystem. So I wrote a book in the past about LLM security, the risks for LLMs, and how to do secure implementations. And the next one, hopefully, it'll come out in a couple of months, is about agentic AI security. Is like, how do you actually secure agents? How do you secure MCPs and A2As and all the various other techniques that we are using today in agentic world? How do you actually secure that? Like, what are the nice algorithms and what are the architectures that we should follow? So hopefully that will be useful to the industry as we are all dabbling with AI as we go forward.
Fantastic. And Marin, if you give us a little information about what you're doing with Applied Quantum, if you want to promote anything, that'd be fantastic.
Excellent, thank you. Applied Quantum is an advisory. You can check it at appliedquantum.com. But I think more useful for the audience is going to be postquantum.com. And I see Corey actually shared one of my articles. Postquantum.com is my blog. I've been writing about this for decades. There is no ads there. There is no sign-ups. It's kind of thousands of articles that are all about this topic. So go and check it out. Even more applicable, we published very comprehensive PQC upgrade frameworks at pqcframework.com. So that's completely free. It's CC 4.0 license. You can use it in commercial. Take it and check it out. And then I do have a book coming out in about 2 weeks, which is Quantum Ready. Exactly this stuff. QuantumReady.com is the book. So now I gave you lots of links, but they're easy to remember. Postquantum.com, pqcframework.com, quantumready.com.
And what I'll do is I'll post all your books and everything else on the chat so people have access to everything too when we start to promote. So I'm going to connect off. If you guys just want to stay on for a second, I'll end the stream. Everyone, thank you so much.